Hello and welcome to the Datacolor 2014 webinar series. I'm David Toby, Product and Technology Manager for the Spider lines of products, and my presenter and partner here today is David Saffer, who has put together a great webinar on the kind of classic topic of screen-to-print match. Freshened it up with new images. I see one for his trip to Bodie last weekend there on the front. So I'm looking forward to hearing this. I'll explain again to any of you who've not done a Datacolor webinar before that you should set the webinar control panel up in such a way that you can see the questions and answers, because there'll be active Q&A going on through typing there on the side that won't be captured as part of the captured tape of the webinar itself. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. We'll do our best to answer them in real time or close to real time, depending on how many questions we get. So there's that, and of course stick around because this is a Henry's sponsored webinar. So we assume that many of the viewers today are Canadian and would like to get discounts at Henry's, which will be given at the end of the webinar, and we also will have a Spider Pro to give away at the end of the webinar. So one of you will win one and the rest will get some chances at reduced prices on a long list of Datacolor products. So stick around for that, and in the meantime, let me introduce David Saffer, who is a professional photographer and photo educator who lives in Southern California, and he's been working with us over the last couple of years on these webinars and is now developing the webinar content for us quite actively. And I appreciate that, as there's so much going on at Datacolor these days. We need all hands on deck. So, David, I hope the wildfires are treating your section of California well, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thanks, David. It's funny you should bring that up. We're in Bodie, which is in the desert in California, north of where I live. It's several hours drive, and the fires are west of this area. And you can smell the smoke even though it's easily 100, 200 miles away. So the fires are quite extensive. It's a very, very dry season. The reservoirs in the eastern sea are for the most part, dry. So this is probably the worst drought in 100 years in California.
Well, if that's a 100-year-old building we're looking at in that first image, it doesn't look to me as though it would withstand a wildfire very well. That's a pretty tinder-based building there.
It would go up in a flash. It's surrounded by dry brush, and it's made out of, local pine, and it's as dry can be. And yes, this building was probably constructed around 1875. I don't think the fire equipment is quite that old, particularly the item on the right, but the item on the left is pretty darned old. The ropes have been replaced, of course, but it's pretty darned old. I shot this with a Canon 5D and a Rokinon 14mm cine lens, of all things, and I cropped it in and straightened out some of the perspective issues. But I really like the light in this, and I really like the venue. It's really quite a place. There's probably 60 or 70 buildings in Bodie.
Well, I was planning to get to the concept of screen-to-print match in mentioning this photo, but first I want to mention the ephemeral nature of the world and the things we photograph. I mean, yes, this has been there for years, and people say, oh yeah, that's a set shot in Bodie, and the answer is set today, could be gone tomorrow. And so there's something to the documentation of things. You never know what you shoot that won't be there tomorrow. And people who look at Yosemite and say it's all made out of granite, it'll look the same in 1,000 years, and the answer is, well, there was a serious wildfire there in the course of this season, and there are places in Yosemite that won't look the same for quite some time.
Yeah. The other thing is that screen-to-print match is an interesting topic in terms of archiving, is that you look at digital storage and you look at some other ways of keeping your images. And prints are still, as far as I'm concerned, the most durable way to archive your prints. A good print, good ink, good paper, in a cool, dry place, stored away nicely, will last over 200 years. And that's definitely the longest-lived archival method that we have for our images nowadays. So if you have important images, you may want to think about printing them out and putting them away for posterity.
Well, having
And
gone through two sizes of floppies and then zips and jazz drives and SideQuests and iOmega drives, and now having gone through CDs and DVDs and Blu-ray discs, I can say that yes, none of those systems are long-term archival in the way that a good print can be.
yeah. Now, I picked this image also in terms of our subject of screen-to-print match because I wanted to show you something. If you look at this image carefully, although the light is very soft and diffused and gentle and very kind to the image, you can also notice that there's a really wide dynamic range in this image from the front to the back. If you look at my cursor, you have areas that are pretty darn bright, for example, the fire nozzle here, or the hose reel here, or the stretcher. But as you go back into the corners, you've got corners here that are close to pure black. And you've got other areas that are darn near at that level, but there is some detail. And in screen-to-print match, part of what you're trying to do is to manage what you're seeing on the screen and managing what the printer is doing to protect your highlight and shadow detail. It's not just about color. You're supposed to protect your dynamic range. You're supposed to protect your colors to get the kind of color that you want to make an appealing, enduring print. So why color management? It's consistent, accurate, predictable, and repeatable color, and it's across a range of devices. So your display is your window into the world of your digital images, and your printer is your output device. It's the machine that's going to make that print for you that's going to last, hopefully, for decades or even centuries. And again, I included this image on the left because of its dynamic range. It's side lit. This is in Monument Valley. This is what's called the totem. It's really quite tall. The perspective of this particular photo kind of diminishes the impact of its height, but it's very, very tall. But you can also see in this image that we have quite the dynamic range. And without the right kind of setup, you are working uphill, no pun intended, in terms of rendering the highlights and the shadows accurately and keeping the colors true to life. The other thing about screen-to-print match is that a lot of people get into a cycle, what I call print tweak, and without a properly calibrated screen and a properly controlled printer, you get into a situation where you're going to send your image to the printer, and you're going to make that print, then you're going to bring it back to your desk and sit down and look at it and compare it to the screen, and you're going to go, that isn't quite it. And one of the reasons might be is that this display isn't calibrated, or it's not calibrated properly, or that your workflow in managing how the printer is operated is not quite correct, and so you make a tweak and you go back and print it. And you come back and you say, well, maybe just a little bit more. And I think you get the idea. Many people make 4 or 5 prints. They're making 8x10s at $1.50 a piece. Pretty soon you've got yourself a $10 or a $12 8x10 print. Now, if you're making, let's say, you've just done a trip to Bodie and you're going to make 5 prints, all of a sudden you've spent 50, 60, maybe more on making your prints, where you could have spent 10. So screen-to-print match, no more wasted prints means no more wasted money either. Now, I put these examples in. I wanted to show you what can happen when you're working on images in that print tweak scenario, and I manipulated these to make a point. These are taken in a place not too far from Bodie. This is in the Eastern Sierra in the fall, I think last year or the year before, probably the year before. And you can see that the image on the upper left has problems with color. In particular, there's too much red and magenta in the image, and that affects the color of the tree trunks, which are supposed to be gray, et cetera, et cetera. The image in the middle is too hot, so we're losing a lot of detail on the leaves. You can't see the individual leaves. And in fact, going back to the image on the left, when the color is that distorted, you also lose some of the micro detail and micro contrast. The image on the right is pretty close. Of course, depending on your web browser, you may see some other differences. But the image on the right is pretty close to what I would want to see before I would print it. And you can see there's nice separation between the leaves. The tree trunks have beautiful light coming down across the trunk here. You've got really good detail in the midtones and softening off into the shadow areas. So, there's really can be significant differences in the same image depending on your editing style and depending upon your management of your output device and all these other issues we've been discussing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through that workflow step by step, and I'm going to talk you through managing your display, a little bit about image editing, particularly when it comes to getting an accurate proof on screen before you print. And I'm going to talk about the workflow in printing. So here's an introduction to that workflow. The first part of it is display calibration and profiling, and that improves your on-screen image quality, accuracy, and consistency. And I included a black and white image here. This is also in Bodhi. I sometimes look at this image and I think if somebody just leaned on one corner of it, the whole thing would collapse. But the idea of display calibration, I do classes all the time, and I ask people, raise your hand if you're calibrating your display. Half the people put their hands up, half don't. Then I say, how many people are calibrating their display once a month regularly like they should be? And that number drops in half. And the thing is that the displays change over time. They're delivered from the factory in terrible shape with the exception of one or two manufacturers. They're typically too bright and too blue, and they're not in any way suitable for editing photographs in a realistic way. So if the display isn't calibrated, guess what? You're in a position where you're editing colors and luminance and shadows to an incorrect destination. You don't really know what you're doing. The image is on screen, and you're editing it to make it look right. But if the screen isn't set to a standard, you're editing, maybe you're going down the wrong road, and you're going to wind up back in that print tweak situation at best. We also, yeah?
I had the experience yesterday of having to borrow my wife's computer to do some testing on, and it had never been calibrated. And so I loaded our software on it and ran a calibration and was as surprised as anybody else to see how much difference it made on this MacBook Pro screen to have been calibrated. My wife is not a professional photographer, but she edits images in iPhoto and prints them out of a Epson multi-purpose printer on a regular basis, so I'm going to be very interested to see how much simpler that process is for her now that her screen is much more accurate to the actual files that she's viewing.
That's interesting because that's a nice computer that she has.
It is, and people make the mistake of assuming, since it's a nice computer, that it must be just fine the way it is, and that's not actually the case.
Most of the people in the stores won't tell you any of this. They won't tell you that you need to calibrate. The places I'm thinking about are the Apple stores in particular. They think their screens are, impervious to issues like this, and it's one of the flaws in the Apple selling cycle is that they don't tell you that you really do need to calibrate your display. Another part of calibrating your display leads us to what's called soft proofing, which I call a color accurate preview. In Photoshop and Lightroom, you can enable a feature which will allow you to see accurately what your print is going to look like before you print it, and we're going to talk about that in detail. This is a feature most people don't know about. It really requires that you are calibrating your display, but once you do, you can set the software up so that you can preview the printer's performance with whatever paper you're going to use. So it can really be an asset to you. Now that you've got correct color standards, and then you can say, I'm going to be working on an Epson 3880, and I'm going to be working with one of their signature papers, and this is what the print should look like, and so you're editing to a known destination. And in my case, at least, I typically will make either no proof prints or one proof print for my fine art images. The system's dialed in, and I know exactly what it's going to do. We're going to talk about profiles for your printer and how you use profiles in your applications like Photoshop and Lightroom so that the printer is well controlled. Many people have the idea that if you calibrate the display, the printer is going to behave. The fact is that they're different devices, and although they both are cousins in the sense that they use RGB at the end of the day, the fact is that display calibration is not going to control the printer. A lot of people make that mistake. You really have to do both. You have to do it on the front end with the display and on the back end with the printer. So let's talk about display calibration. This is an image by a friend of mine named Rick Russell. This is in Monument Valley. This is up on it's Hunt's. I think it's called Hunt's Plaza, but I'm having a bit of a brain cramp at the moment. This is a very hard place to get to, so this is a rare photograph. And I'm going to take my pointer and I'm going to show you something you probably can't really see, but there's a little dot right there. That's a pickup truck. That gives you an idea of the scale of this place. This was an image that was very difficult to capture because the lighting there is typically very harsh and contrasty. He got very lucky that day in that there was some cloud cover, and of course it was late in the day, so the sun is coming in on an angle, and so he was able to render a lot of the detail on the rocks and good detail in the shadows. And of course when he goes to make the print, he's going to want to see those details and see those accurate colors. And a color managed workflow is the only way that you're going to get that consistently. So why display calibration? Let's talk a little bit about the front end of color management in screen to print match. Every display has its own color signature. Even displays from the same manufacturer, in a week's time that manufacturer may change some of the construction standards for the display. It happens all the time. And so the color accuracy of the display is a little bit of a moving target. Also, displays change over time. Essentially, whatever is lighting the display from the back, it's still some type of light bulb. And those lighting systems change over time. And that means that over time, say once a month with a normal computer, it's really important that you take that spider and you run through the software, and doing a recalibration takes 5-6 minutes, and go through it and get the color under control, get the highlight and shadow detail where they need to be, and that includes screen brightness, get your mid-tone transitions to be accurate and pleasing, and of course you want to make sure that you're taking care of the screen in the sense that there's something of a match to ambient light. If you're working in a really dark room, the screen brightness might be a little bit lower. If you're working in a moderately bright room, the screen brightness might be a little bit higher to compensate. Now, display calibration, some of the workflow applications include screen to print match. For those of you that are shooting commercially from time to time or are doing still life and things like that, you may be shooting tethered. If you're shooting tethered, you definitely want to have accurate representation on screen. You may be sharing work in a work group or sharing work between different people doing editing. You may be showing your portfolio or doing field reviews. And just for a point in fact, the Spider 4 line has an application that's free that will allow you to color calibrate your iPad or your iPhone. You might need it for presentations. Some of the people ask me all the time about displays that might be good for them. I'm going to say the thing that's last on the list is probably one of the first things you should take a look at. CNET.com is a website that does a lot of computer and equipment reviews, and they have quite the extensive database on displays. And at least up until a couple of months ago, they've been updating it pretty regularly. And one of the authors there is Eric Franklin. He's done an excellent job in the past on putting together this information. And I have relied on it myself in terms of my selection of displays. They go through the characteristics of the display and its performance in looking at photos and looking at games and videos and things like that. Some of the better displays that are around are the Dell UltraSharp line. Some of the better LaCie. Azo is always a good one, although they're pricey. They're a little pricey. NEC Multisync. Those are some of the displays for computers that I suggest that you take a look at if you're thinking of getting a new device. Now, how does display calibration work? You can see the spider on the screen here, and then there's a red patch behind it. And in fact, I'll show you well, I'm going to try and describe to you how this works. The software is very straightforward. You tell it what kind of display that you have, you let it communicate with our database over the internet, and you give it a certain settings, which I'll tell you what those are in a moment. And then it runs through a series of color patches, gray patches, black and white, and it's looking for the range of luminance, it's looking for the accuracy of each color patch, and it's comparing them to what's called a known standard or standard colors, and it's calculating the difference and saving that in a report. That table is going to be used right at that point, and then every time you restart your computer to set the display to the proper parameters so that your dynamic range is going to be correct, your shadow and highlight details are going to be protected, your colors are going to be accurate, so green grass is going to look green instead of magenta, the blue skies are going to look blue instead of cyan, skin tones are going to be accurate, etc., etc. So then when you start editing, you're editing from a known point to a known destination. It makes it much easier, first of all, for you to make the correct decisions, and it makes it much easier for you to get the correct results. This is one of the screens that comes up in the Spider 4 Elite software. You can see right here up at the top, there's the first time you do it, you would use a full calibration, which runs through the whole routine. It's a little over 10 minutes. At any time you want after you've calibrated, you can do a check cal, which just runs through a brief review of how your display is doing. And what most people do once a month is they do a recal, which recalibrates the display. It takes a little bit less time, but it has the same effect of bringing the display into line. Now, you might want to jot these down. We're also going to post a recorded version of this webinar for you to review at a later date. But the gamma that we normally recommend is gamma 2.2. The white point that we recommend is 6500K. And the brightness level that we recommend for a good screen-to-print match is around 120. Now, I'm going to throw in a little bit of information that's maybe a little bit repetitive. But the screens that you see in the stores are cranked up. They're cranked up. They come out. First of all, the white point is not set at the factory for most manufacturers, so they're running at around 9000K. They're very, very blue. And the brightness level is probably at 300, roughly 3 times the level that you need for photography. That means that your highlights are completely blown out. You're seeing stuff in the shadows that you should never see in a photograph. And that means that when you go to edit your photo, you're probably going to get an unexpected result, either when you publish it to the web or when you print it or you show it to somebody on your laptop. So I really suggest, and if you go to these settings, it's going to look a little bit different. It's going to take you a couple of days to get used to it, but it's worth it. Okay. Now, one of the other things that we have in the software is we have a before and after comparison. And on the right here, I've enlarged the before version of this. There's a thing on here that there's a button here that says switch, excuse me. And you can see here that the skin tones are washed out. All the colors are too light. The screen is probably too bright. You can see that the sky, the blue in the sky is not really blue. There's definitely a tint in the black and white areas. So it's really not accurate color. Also note, just for a moment, that these are organized into 4 quadrants. These quadrants each have a particular type of image. So we have black and white, we have people and skin tones, we have colors, either artificial like beads and things like that, natural colors and fruit. There's some flowers over here and a color chart. And then we have some landscapes. If you double click on any of these, they will enlarge and fill the panel so you can look at them more closely. Now if I click switch and I go to after, look at the difference here in the calibrated result. In particular, take a look at black and white first. Look at how neutral it is. Look at how nicely the shadow transitions on the woman's chin are. Look at the transitions in the midtones in the stairway, things like that. Over here on the left in the landscape, the grass is vibrant and green and looks real. In the church, the stone looks the right color and the sky is nice and blue. So it's really quite quite the big difference. I think you can understand at this point that it's going to make your life much easier when you're editing and then you're going to output your prints at a later date or send them over to the web. Now, I also want to offer you a tip as far as your workspace and managing your workspace. Now, I put this picture in. It's a very nice photograph. Beautiful view out the window. I wish I had that view. But here's the problem. It's too bright. It's letting a lot of light, blue light, mostly blue light, bouncing off the ocean and the sky into your workspace. And your eye adapts to the brightest thing in the room. So that's the first problem. The other thing is that to compensate for this level of brightness, you're going to have to crank that screen brightness up pretty high. Now you're starting to get into territory where you're distorting the appearance of the image on screen. So in this case, what I'd suggest you do is put a shade or blinds over the window while you're working, or even work at night. Some people work on their images at night, or both. But what you don't want to do is have the window be the brightest thing in the room. You want the screen to be the brightest thing in the room, and you want the screen to be set to a brightness level that will let you get a good screen to print match. And that's typically not the way they come to you out of the box. So big, bright, sunny windows, great for your morale, makes you feel good during the day, but doesn't serve you well when you're editing photographs. Now let's talk about taking that display, that screen calibration, and making it work for you even more. And there's a tool that's available in Photoshop and Lightroom, just as an example, that I would have to say at least half the people I talk to, if not 3/4, don't really know about. And it's called soft proofing. Now that's an archaic term. It's a carryover from the days when people were using 4-color press to print magazines and things like that, and they would do soft proofing on screen instead of doing what's called a hard proof, which is a test run on the printer. Now, soft proofing to me is a live color preview, and what it does is it lets you set the computer to emulate or simulate your output device. And for this, in this case, we're going to assume that it's a desktop printer or a medium format printer and a particular type of paper. And I'm going to show you how you set the software up to achieve that and make it easier for you to do your image editing. If you've got soft proofing enabled, and I turn on that live color preview before I start editing an image, I almost always got a pretty good idea of which paper I'm going to use and which printer I'm going to be printing on. If I've got soft proofing enabled, then when I'm doing my editing, again, I'm heading to a known destination. When I make a change in the density of the image, for example, if I made a levels adjustment to this image, I would know right away if I was going to bury the details in the eye on this butterfly or some of the details in the wings over here. Similarly, if I was going to increase the brightness in the levels or curves, I would know right away whether or not I was going to blow out the detail in this highly saturated area here. If I made changes in hue and saturation, I would know whether or not my green background was going to start looking magenta in my print. So I don't have to make a proof print to know what the result is going to be. I'm going to see it on screen in real time every time I make an edit. That's a really powerful tool. But again, you have to have a calibrated display, and you have to know how to work the software. So here's how it goes. I'm going to do this for Photoshop and Lightroom. In the Photoshop panel, you're going to go to View, and you're going to go to Proof Setup and Custom. Now, again, I have to apologize. I always find myself apologizing for Adobe because there's a group of engineers there that have a vocabulary that's not used by the rest of us normal photographers. But this is the vocabulary they use, and you're just going to have to remember it until they wise up and change it to something that's more user-friendly. You're going to see this panel, see the red arrow? So this panel is going to jump out, and you're going to see it say Custom Proof Condition, Custom, and then you're going to go to Device to Simulate. Now it just happens when I made this screenshot that I was using Moab paper. That's not necessarily the paper I'm recommending. One of my favorite papers lately has been the signature papers from Epson, particularly the Hot Press Bright. I'm getting really great results on that with my fine art prints. You would specify the profile that you have for that paper. Now, you can get these profiles from the manufacturers. You can also get, whether it's Epson or a third-party manufacturer, and you can get those profiles from them. And I want to make a quick note about that. They're good profiles. They're not the best you can do in many cases. Those profiles are made basically as an average over a number of printers, dozens or hundreds of machines. Here's the problem. They're not the machine that's sitting on your desk or in your studio or workshop. And so as we get into the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about making a custom profile that's tailored to your printer, which gives you an even greater level of performance. So right now, though, we're going to talk about device to simulate. We're going to use a paper profile and tells the printer how to behave. In a lot of ways, it's similar to what you're doing with your display. You're bringing the printer into line with standardized color sets. For your first try, you can try a rendering intent. There are other rendering intents underneath this called saturation and colorimetric. You can experiment with those. I guarantee the picture police will not come to your house if you make a test print using other rendering intents. Some prints do better with different rendering intents, and for example, black and white frequently is better with an absolute colorimetric rendering intent. Once you click OK, the screen that you see is going to reflect the color corrections that were made in this profile. That screen is going to show you what that print is going to look like coming from that printer with that paper and ink set. So that live color preview is your friend. It's going to allow you to make your edits and see the impact in real time. And you're going to get out of that print tweak cycle that we talked about a little while ago. So I made a couple of examples, and I admit that I tweaked them unmercifully to make the point. This is pretty much the one I tweaked. I made it a lot brighter and a lot thinner, and this is emulating what might happen on, say, a watercolor paper with a very rough finish, which means that it doesn't take a lot of ink. The density goes down, so it's not as rich in the darks, for example, right here as compared to right here. It tends to not holding as much ink. The highlights are going to tend to blow out a little bit earlier. And these are all things that you need to know when you're, how do I put this? These are all things that you need to know when you're doing your editing so that you don't go off track. David, I have to leave the phone for a moment. Can you please take over?
I'd be happy to take over, but since I'm not running this, this presentation, we'll be stuck on this same screen here while we're doing that. I always find that soft proofing is related very much to the media you're using. We used to talk a lot about soft proofing to newsprint because you wanted to optimize your images if they were going to be printed in the newspaper. But in these days of fine art inkjet printing, I find that my preferred media is not the glossy stuff that you get at the photo store. My preferred media is matte media, which means watercolor-like papers. And the difference that you're seeing between these two images reminds me very much of the difference you're likely to see between a gloss print, which would be like the one at the upper left, and a matte print, which would be like the one at the lower right. So sometimes what you're doing with soft proofing is getting the opportunity to see what your print is going to look like on the kind of media you're printing on. And the result is you can then, while you can't make the blacks blacker or the brightest yellows yellower, you can choose to darken your shadows, and you can choose to saturate and darken your yellows to some degree to emulate that effect as best you can on a weaker media, a media that doesn't have the massive color or dynamic range of the glossy stuff.
I'm sorry I had to do that.
No problem. I'll go back to typing answers to people's questions.
Okay. Now here's how you do this in Lightroom. It's easier to do this in Lightroom than it is in Photoshop. In Lightroom, if you're in the Develop module, all you have to do is click on the soft proofing panel button in the panel right here. That gets you started. Now, of course, you're going to have to go to the proof settings. So let me back up here. It's a drop down in one of these in the you see the histogram and basic, and then if you go a little further down, you'll see the one for soft proofing. You'll enable that, and then you can see here it says profile, and these small buttons, which are hard to see, unfortunately, you can get a drop-down list of all the profiles that are available on your computer, and you can select the one that you want to use for your soft proof or your profiling. Again, here I've selected the perceptual rendering intent. You can also select relative. I normally stay away from the simulate paper and ink in either Photoshop or Lightroom. I don't find that they're particularly accurate. Now, once you've done this, you're going to find that there's going to be a change in the appearance. So this is the fiberglass, which is pretty similar. Most screens are going to give you a rendering for glossy or luster paper that's close to what the printer output's going to give you. But if you're using a fine art or a soft finish paper like this one, all of a sudden you're going to see that your blacks are not as dense, again, because the paper doesn't take, a lot of these papers don't take ink as well, and they tend to absorb the ink rather than have the ink sort of float on the surface of the paper. And so you may wind up wanting to make adjustments to improve the density of your blacks and improve the saturation of your colors. But at least now that you're in the soft proofing, that you've done what you need to do to enable that, you're in a situation where you're editing to that known destination again. You can make those changes in the blacks and be reasonably confident that when you make your print, that it's going to give you the result that you expect. Without a calibrated display and without soft proofing, there's a much less of a chance that you're going to get that kind of result that you want, a really nice fine art print that could be sellable. Let's talk for a minute about making custom profiles for your printer. I talked before about each printer is unique. Each printer has a color gamut or a range of color rendered. Depending on the design of the printer, it's different between printers. This is an Epson 3880. It's one of my favorites. It's a very stable printer, and it calibrates extremely well with our tool, SpiderPrint. I've done a lot of installations here in Southern California with this. This is one of the great, I wouldn't even call it entry level because there are printers that are less expensive, but it's a modest expense for most photographers, and it really gives results that are way beyond its price point. You can use ICC profiles supplied by the manufacturers, but the fact is that you will get better results, particularly in the highlight details and in highly saturated areas with custom profiles, because they're tailored to the printer and the media or the paper that you're using and the environment. And environment is one of the key issues here in managing a printer. In some areas of the country, you may be sitting in a place where it's summertime and it's warm out and the humidity is very high. Where I live in this summertime, it's hot out and the humidity is 10%. So that's going to have a significant impact on the printer performance, on how the ink drops are laid down, how fast they dry, and how the print is rendered on the paper. And that may not be the same condition that existed when they did the canned profile at the factory or at the paper manufacturer. So tailored profiles generally will give a better result. Now, is it a 50% improvement? Probably not, but it's a noticeable improvement. And if you really are taking the time and taking, how do I put this, putting the effort in to manage your camera on the capture side and doing all that work on the editing side, and you really want to get the most out of your print, a custom tailored profile is the way to go. Now, just for a moment, I'm going to talk about media selection, and then I'm going to talk about using SpiderPrint. Media selection, if you're working with images that have strong contrast in color and a robust dynamic range, you might want to think about the old standards, the glossy and luster papers. Frequently people use the Epson premium luster. That is also one of my favorites, although there are a lot of competitors that do a great job with papers in this category. If you really want super high contrast, there are specialty finish papers such as metallic. They're very contrasty. The contrast areas are going to be sharp edged. They, in some cases, are going to look more dimensional. The ink tends to float more on the paper. The papers tend to be a little bit fragile, so once they're printed, it doesn't pay to keep them around and handle them. The sooner you get them in a frame, the better. Watercolor style papers, sometimes called fine art papers, give a more soft or a more painterly look, and they have less dynamic range, generally speaking. Watercolor is a carryover from watercolor painting. It's a style. It's a soft finish, not a hard, glossy, or luster finish. There's no coating on that. The coating is different, I should say. And so florals, landscapes, if you want a painterly portrait, some of these watercolor papers or fine art papers are great for black and white. Keep in mind that there's more variation in terms of the base tone of the paper in the watercolor papers. In other words, some of these papers look warm. They have a warm or a slight yellow cast to them. And some of these papers are a little cooler. They have brighteners or other elements added to them to make them look brighter and whiter. And so there's more of a range in terms of picking the base tone, and the base tone that you pick is going to have some effect on the final outcome, on the final print. These performance characteristics require profiling. You can run the print through the printer on what's called printer managed color, but you're probably going to get an unexpected result. When you're working with the customized papers, you really want to be using a profile. Now, what's going to happen when you make a custom profile? I'm going to skip forward a couple of pages and just show you what you're going to print out. And I think you'll immediately see that where the similarity between this and display calibration comes from. You print a multi-page target which has standardized colors on it, and you're going to use a device like this to read all of those colors and decide whether the colors are being printed by the printer accurately or they're being printed by the printer inaccurately. And the computer and the software are going to calculate those differences, save the data for you, and create a paper profile, a printer profile. And that printer profile is used every time you send a print to the printer. It's going to tell the printer how to handle those colors, how to handle dynamic range, to give you the best possible result on that individual machine. Now, you can use that profile on another printer. Let's say you have a 3880 and you have a colleague or friend that also has a 3880. That profile will work on that other printer, but it's not tailored to that printer. It's just in the ballpark. So going back to the beginning, we're going to see a screen that says you can learn about color management. We have a lot of material underneath the screen that will teach you about how to use the device and how to leverage color management to best advantage. Or you can profile your printer, which is what we're going to get into. Before you begin, you're going to enter some important information. The idea is that this is actually going to be printed. I'm going to skip to another slide here. It's not showing here because I cropped it, but what's going to happen is once you put this information in and you print that target, this data is going to be printed on the target as well, so that if you have multiple targets for multiple papers, you can tell them apart. It's a good idea to save them. I'm not going to get into the reasons for that right now, but it's a good idea to save them for later use. You're going to pick the target that you want to use, and you can see here, here's the data printing. You can't see the details, but it's underneath the target image. Typically what I'd use is the high quality target plus grays. You get 225 patches plus extended grays on 2 sheets. That's a very reasonable number of patches. It will give you a very accurate target. Some people think more is better. They go for 729 patches plus extended grays on 4 sheets. That takes significantly more time. In a lot of cases, it's not going to give you a significantly better result. So what I tell people is start with this second level target and see how you do. And at that point, you can decide whether or not you need to, up your game and go for the more intense exercise. Briefly, I'm going to talk about how you make that target print. When you click on print here, you're going to see the splash screen or the control screen for your printer driver on your computer. And here's a little bit of a caveat. They're all different. Epson, HP, Canon, all have different screens. I wish they would put their heads together and standardize, but unfortunately they're not. I'm not going to go through all of the details on this. I'm going to point out some important things, and I would suggest that you study the manual for the printer and understand this printer driver as best you can before you get started. You're going to select the printer that you're using. Obviously, it has to be connected to the computer. You're going to select the media type. In this case, we're printing on photoluster. The output resolution, there's several levels of resolution here. I normally pick on the Epson printers 1440. There's another setting above it called 2880, and typically that doesn't give you an improved result. The 2880 is sort of a better and bestest kind of situation. At 2880, it's one print in 100 or even one print in 500 where you're going to see a significant difference in the outcome. Sometimes it depends on the paper and how fast the paper absorbs ink, but certainly for the purposes of printing the target, 1440 DPI will do the job. The other thing that you have to do, this is a must, is to turn off the driver color management. Now this exists in different places, it's hidden in different tabs, etc., etc. If you have trouble doing this, or you can't find it in your printer driver, Adobe makes what's called the Adobe Color Printer Utility. It's free. It's on the Adobe Labs website, and you can take our target and you can print it using that utility with that, and it will bypass all the color management in the printer driver and give you a clean target to scan. So that's something to keep in mind. It's free, it's easy to use, you don't have to struggle with the manufacturer's printer driver. A lot of people do this, including me. So once you have the target, the principles are very similar to the display. It's going to print a series of color patches. You're going to measure and calculate corrections and create an ICC profile. That profile is saved on your computer by your operating system, and it's used during printing. So I'm going to show you how to do this in a moment. You're going to tell the printer what to do, in part by using that ICC profile. You're going to get better color accuracy, better shadow highlight detail, better mid-tone transitions, and more. And you're going to be closing in on that goal of this webinar, which is to get a good screen-to-print match. Now, when you create your fine art print, let's say you've completed the scan and you've got your ICC profile completed, and you go to the print module in Lightroom, for example, and you go to print your job. See down here it says color management, and outlined in red, the default is managed by printer. Here's the problem with managing by the printer. It's going to do a reasonably good job. I'm not going to disrespect it. It's not going to give you trash, but it's going to give you an average print. What's the reason? The biggest reason is that it has a set of standardized settings or presets that are stored in a brain in the printer that's about the size of a pea. So it has limited processing power, limited options, and limited range. And so that pea brain is going to be making your fine art print. On the other hand, if you use the ICC profile you're using in the computer, in the software, using the computer and the software, that big brain that you spent all that money for is going to tell the printer what to do. Huge difference. Huge difference. And it's going to be tailored to that printer. So what you're going to do is you're going to say in the profile, you're going to select the profile that you're going to use. You're going to tell it the rendering intent. And now the computer is in charge of the printer. You're in charge of the printer. And you're well on your way to creating a fine art print that has good screen-to-print match. One other thing is that when you go to print, you do have to tell it which kind of paper it's using. I think that's very important. There's a number of types of paper here. You can see fine art paper, matte paper, etc. These change the way the printer behaves in terms of its paper handling, particularly in terms of thickness or the finish on the paper. Swinging back over to, let me see here. Am I duplicating things here? Yes, I just want to reemphasize this is a slightly different printer driver. You can see that it's telling you that the Epson driver color management is off. I want to reemphasize that. If you go to Photoshop, the screen is going to look different. It's got some interesting features in it. One of them is that you get another soft proofing look at your print before you make the print. So if you click on this Match Print Colors, and in color handling, you are using Photoshop Manages Colors, and the printer profile says it has the printer profile specified here. This is a drop-down list like I mentioned before, and you can select from amongst the printer profiles that you've created or that have been loaded onto your printer. Now, I want to repeat something. If you select Printer Manage Color, the P-brain in the printer is in control. If you select Photoshop or Application, sometimes it's called Application Manage Color, depending on the printer driver, then that's going to put the computer in charge, along with your ICC profile for printing. So now you've got your display calibration, you've got your soft proofing, and now you've got your printer profile all working together. It's a three-legged stool. You can't take one leg away and expect it to work. So this looks complicated. It's not. Once you get this set up, setting it up is going to take you far more time than it's going to execute regularly when you're making your prints and creating your fine art galleries or your portfolios. The fact is that once you get used to this, it just goes 1, 2, 3, and you're done with it. So getting it set up, yes, there's a little bit of work involved, a little bit of investment in time and learning how to run the gear, just like when you get a new camera. But once you're done with it, you're gold. So here's some tips on printing. We're closing in on the finish time. View your prints in a user-friendly environment. Now, what does that mean? You want to use daylight balanced desk lamp or viewing station. And daylight balanced desk lamps, there are lamps offered right now that are very inexpensive. Philix, F-I-I-L-E-X, is one of the companies that makes those. We're partners with them, but we don't get any benefit from recommending them. They make a really great daylight balanced desk lamp. It's a good way for you with a daylight balanced desk lamp. You can put it on your desk next to your display. You can look at the print next to your screen and see how you're doing with your screen to print match, see how the printer is performing. You can also do it at a window that's facing north. It doesn't have a lot of, say, green foliage outside it or other bright colors that are being reflected into the window. That's a good sort of a plan B. The lighting that you don't want to use includes office fluorescence. The color coming from office fluorescence or household incandescent bulbs, they're just not your friend. You're going to get strange colors if you're looking at your prints in that kind of lighting conditions. When you look at the prints, you want to check them for natural color rendering. You want to look at your highlight and shadow detail, etc. You want to see if there's anything amiss. And places that you would find them, for example, in an image like this, is I would get my nose right up against the print and I would look at the details in the leaves. If the leaves are too saturated or I have over-edited the image, a lot of that detail will disappear. These little water droplets will tend to blend into the leaf or into the background. The edges of the branches will start to pick up color from the background if you've over-edited or if there's something going on with the printer that's not correct. So God is in the details here. You really want to get close to it and inspect it and make sure that everything is working properly. Now, if you've been doing your homework, as I've suggested in this, you shouldn't see this very often. What you should see is a really pleasing print with good highlight and shadow details, normal color and accurate color rendering, just a really nice print that you can sell or display with pride. Now with some printers, particularly the Epsons, if you're going to frame them or put them in storage, it's a really good idea to let them dry overnight before you either store them or evaluate them. It's also a good idea to get neutral archival interleaving paper. It's tissue paper. It's cheap. The prints will dry better and more quickly if you put these interleaving sheets in between them, and you can put them in a pile. Just put the interleaving sheet down and then gently put the next print on top of it and then put the interleaving sheet down. The interleaving sheets help draw the solvents in the water out of the print more quickly, and they do give a better result, and that's been told to me by several people from the different paper manufacturers. So we're going to wrap up. It's relatively easy to get prints that match your display. There's three main elements, right? There's calibrating the display, managing your image editing software for soft proofing, and managing your printer correctly. You can improve your image quality from capture to print with a very modest investment in time and money, and it's going to save you time, ink, and paper. When I first got into color managed printing setups, I thought it would take me forever to recoup my investment, and it literally took weeks for me to get my money back in terms of saved paper and time when I first started doing this. It's easy to use for the beginner, and it has the flexibility and real power for professionals and aspiring professionals. So I think just about anybody can take advantage of this and get a better result. Now we have many recorded webinars on our website at spider.datacolor.com. We don't necessarily talk about color management all the time. We try to help people become better photographers. So we have information about conversions of still and motion capture, floral photography, portraiture, architecture, travel photography, focus controls, macro, remote triggering. There are more than 35 recorded webinars in English, and then there are a number of webinars in European languages. So we have quite a library. I urge you to take advantage of it. It's all free. We're working on our schedule for the fall. We're going to be publishing that soon. We're going to be starting up again in October, and that will be available to you in the near future. Now let me get to my screen here. Okay, the winner of the Spider 4 Pro is Michael Connolly. Congratulations, Michael. Our marketing manager is going to send you a follow-up email asking you for your contact information, and we will get that in the mail to you soon. I want to thank Datacolor and Henry's for sponsoring this webinar. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you got a lot out of it. Again, as I said, there are other complimentary webinars available on the website that you can take advantage of at datacolor.com or spider.datacolor.com. And our co-sponsor, Henry's, is www.henrys.com. There are discounts available on Datacolor products. These are listed in Canadian dollars. I'm not going to sit here and read these to you because you're going to be getting an email shortly that has all this information on it. But you can see that the discounts are significant. The discounts are valid through the 8th of October. I want to point out that for all my students, I'm perfectly willing to answer questions, My email is at the bottom of this screen. It's dsaffer@mac.com. I can't promise that I'll answer you the same day. I get a lot of emails and there's a lot going on. So if I don't answer you that first day, please nag me. Ping me with another email and say, I sent you one before. I'm sorry you missed it. Ask your question again. Don't be shy about that. There's a lot of email traffic, and there are times where I miss an email in the clutter. My blog is davidsaffer.wordpress.com. My partner David Toby also has an excellent blog at cdtoby.wordpress.com. I appreciate you joining us today. I hope you got what you needed out of this webinar, and I hope you'll join us again. Have a great week.